experience, and when the yearning for something real outweighs the comfort of falsehoods, that moment is upon us. In this moment, spiritual clarity becomes essential, for this is not only a political awakening, it is a moral and existential one. It forces us to confront the question, what does it mean to be truly free? Is it enough to have the right to speak if no one in power is listening? Is it enough to vote if the outcomes never reflect the will of the people? Is it enough to protest if the laws are written to ignore those protests? Freedom cannot live on appearances alone. It must be rooted in truth, justice, and accountability. Yet this clarity is not meant to lead to despair. It is meant to ignite action. Once we recognize that the emperor has no clothes, we are no longer bound by the rules of pretense. We are free to organize outside the accepted frameworks, to build new forms of community, and to reimagine power not as something hoarded from above, but shared from below. The collapse of the illusion does not weaken the people, it empowers them. For when the spell is broken, the real work can begin. And that work begins as we peel back another layer of this crisis. The realization that injustice is not a bug in the system, but a core feature. We must now examine how inequality, exploitation, and oppression are not merely tolerated by the system, but essential to its function. There is a painful but necessary truth that must be spoken. The injustice that defines so much of American life is not a mistake. It is not the consequence of poor management or unfortunate oversight. It is the product of design, a design that has evolved, adapted, and masked itself through language, law, and culture, but a design nonetheless. The growing divide between wealth and poverty, the racialized structure of opportunity and punishment, the destruction of the natural world, these are not random, they are built into the very architecture of the system. One cannot understand inequality without understanding power, and power, in its modern form, depends on hierarchy. For a small group to possess immense control, others must be rendered voiceless or invisible. Economic systems are carefully arranged so that profit flows upward while risk and suffering trickle down. Communities of color are disproportionately targeted by policing, environmental toxins, and disinvestment, not because the system fails them, but because it was never built to serve them in the first place. What some experience as dysfunction, others experience as a blueprint working exactly as intended. We must reject the comforting lie that the system is neutral. It is not. It has never been. From the founding of the nation, which enshrined slavery in law, to the redlining and segregation of the 20th century, to the mass incarceration and wage stagnation of today, the arc has been consistent. Policies are crafted not in ignorance of their outcomes, but often in anticipation of them, and the justification is always dressed in the language of necessity, security, or growth. But beneath that language lies a brutal logic: sacrifice the many for the wealth of the few. This sacrifice is not limited to human lives. The planet itself is a casualty of this design. The same economic logic that permits the exploitation of workers also permits the cutting of forests, the poisoning of rivers, and the warming of the atmosphere. Nature, like labor, is treated as expendable, and those most affected by ecological collapse, indigenous peoples, rural workers, and the urban poor are, again, the ones least protected, least heard, and least prioritized. The system is intersectional in its cruelty, yet to recognize that injustice is designed is not to declare defeat. It is to declare clarity, because what has been designed can be dismantled. What has been normalized can be exposed, and what has been imposed from above can be confronted from below. There is great power in naming the truth, for when people stop blaming themselves for their suffering, when they stop seeing poverty as personal failure or oppression as isolated misfortune, They begin to rise with shared purpose. This is the spiritual reawakening of solidarity, the rediscovery of the truth that our destinies are not separate. The system may tell us otherwise. It may pit worker against worker, neighbor against neighbor, race against race. But this, too, is part of the design: divide and conquer. The antidote to this is not more hatred or suspicion. It is radical compassion, radical truth, and radical unity. When people begin to see that their pain is not unique but systemic, the spark of collective resistance is born. It is not enough to protest the outcomes of the system. We must challenge its very foundation. That requires more than policy reform. It requires a cultural and moral transformation. It requires lifting the veil from our eyes and seeing that exploitation is not accidental. It is organized. It is embedded in tax codes, zoning laws, immigration policies, media narratives, and historical memory. It must be rooted out in every space it hides and replaced with systems rooted in justice, dignity, and care. And this work begins by tracing how these injustices are protected, not just by power, but by narrative. The next layer to explore is the myth of exceptionalism, the ideological armor that shields empire and inequality from scrutiny. We must now turn our attention to how this myth has blinded a people and enabled a state to do, abroad and at home, what would otherwise be unconscionable. Every empire tells a story about itself, and perhaps no empire has spun a more seductive tale than the one told by the United States. It is a myth carefully constructed over centuries, a story of freedom, opportunity, moral courage, and divine favor. This mythology claims that the nation is not just a country, but an idea, unique, chosen, and righteous in its mission. But myths, when left unchallenged, become prisons. They bind a people to illusions, even as the ground beneath them gives way. The myth of exceptionalism serves a specific purpose: to obscure contradiction. It allows a society that has perpetuated slavery, genocide, segregation, and endless war to still claim moral superiority. It enables policies that devastate communities abroad while insisting they are acts of liberation. It cloaks systemic racism, economic exploitation, and environmental collapse in the language of progress. It convinces people to see violence as virtue, to see suffering as someone else's fault, and to see empire as benevolence. This story is powerful not because it is true, but because it has been repeated relentlessly in textbooks, films, speeches, and ceremonies. Children grow up pledging allegiance to a flag before they understand the meaning of allegiance. Citizens are taught to equate patriotism with obedience, dissent with disloyalty, and criticism with betrayal. The myth demands not just belief, it demands silence in the face of contradiction, and that silence has cost the world dearly. The most dangerous myths are not those told by tyrants, but those we tell ourselves. When a society believes it is the greatest in history, it becomes blind to its own failings. When it believes it is always on the side of justice, it stops listening to the cries of its victims. When it believes it is immune to collapse, it ignores the warning signs until it is too late. Exceptionalism is not just a lie, it is a spiritual poison. It numbs conscience, it fosters arrogance, and it disables the capacity for self-reflection. But the truth, when spoken with courage, can heal. America is not the worst nation, nor the best. It is a nation like all others, built by human hands, capable of great beauty and deep cruelty. To love this country, truly love it, is to reject the myth and embrace the struggle to make it better. It is to acknowledge the horrors of its past, the injustices of its present, and the possibilities of a transformed future. Real patriotism does not mean pride without reflection. It means responsibility without denial. This moment in history demands a new kind of honesty, one that does not flinch from uncomfortable truths. It demands that we reckon with the full weight of history, not to drown in guilt, but to rise in clarity. For only when the myth is broken can new stories begin, stories rooted in humility, solidarity, and shared humanity. The myth has served the powerful long enough. It is time to serve the truth. Breaking free of this narrative does not make us weaker. It makes us stronger. It prepares us for the difficult work of dismantling empire and building justice. It prepares us to see other nations not as threats or inferiors, but as fellow travelers in the shared project of survival and dignity. And it prepares us to turn inward, to confront the decaying structures within our own borders that the myth has allowed us to ignore for too long. This internal reckoning is critical because as myths crumble, the foundations of daily life begin to tremble. What was hidden becomes visible. What was accepted becomes intolerable, and so we must now shift our focus to the reality that no Savior is coming from above, and that real change must come, as it always has, from below. It is one of the most persistent and damaging illusions of our time that change will come from the top, that if we elect the right leaders, wait for the right moment, or trust the right institutions, justice will trickle down and liberation will arrive. But history teaches otherwise. Real transformation, the kind that reshapes societies, rights wrongs, and lifts up the forgotten, has never been granted from above. It has always been demanded from below. Political elites do not dismantle the structures that give them power. Corporate leaders do not volunteer to redistribute wealth. Institutions built to protect privilege do not willingly open their doors to the marginalized. That kind of change does not happen by permission. It happens through struggle, through sacrifice, through the collective refusal of ordinary people to accept the unacceptable any longer. It was not presidents or senators who ended segregation, who won labor protections, or who fought for women's rights. It was workers, students, mothers, immigrants, artists, and visionaries, many of them nameless to history, who rose together when it was neither safe nor convenient. They did not wait for permission. They acted from conscience, and in doing so, they revealed where the real power always resides, with the people. There is a sacred energy that lives in collective action. When people come together, not just to protest what is wrong, but to build what is right, they awaken something ancient and unstoppable. It is not chaos, it is not destruction, it is creation. It is the force that has always driven human progress, the refusal to let injustice harden into fate. Every movement that has shaped the arc of moral history has begun this way, with courage, with truth, and with unity from below. Yet the dominant culture works tirelessly to suppress this truth. We are taught to believe that power is something distant and reserved for the few, that politics is too complex, that movements are dangerous, that nothing we do can really make a difference. These are not harmless ideas. They are weapons.